Welcome to the Fun Astrology and Merriman Market Analyst Saturday Financial Podcast. I'm Thomas Miller. Thanks for joining us. This is the free weekly newsletter that's published every weekend on MMAcycles.com by Ray Merriman, but a little bit abbreviated this week because Ray is busy authoring the 2025 forecast book, the 49th edition that he has been writing since the mid-1970s. This is being released on November 2nd for the week beginning November 4th, but first we look back before we look forward. The first article is from Wednesday, October 30th, from Harriet Torrey from the Wall Street Journal. The U.S. economy continued its recent strong stretch this summer. Gross domestic product increased at a 2.8 annual rate in the third quarter, adjusted for seasonality and inflation, the Commerce Department said Wednesday. That was a slight slowdown from the second quarter's 3% rate and below economists' expectations for a 3.1% pace. Still, the July to September period marked a continuation of roughly a two-year streak of strong growth for the U.S. economy, even in the face of historically high borrowing costs. This is from CNBC.com on Friday. Job creation in October slowed to its weakest pace since 2020. As the impacts of storms in the southeast and a significant labor impasse dented the employment picture. Non-farm payrolls increased by 12,000 for the month, down sharply from September and below the Dow Jones estimate for 100,000. In what had already been expected to be a downbeat report, October posted the smallest gain since December of 2020. The unemployment rate, however, held at 4.1%, in line with expectations. Now Ray's commentary on the week past. He says it was a rough week for most global stock indices, yet this is consistent with my prior observations that U.S. stock indices tend to sell off rather sharply into a low within 2 weeks of the presidential election. That appears to have happened last week and might still be underway. In Asia and the Pacific Rim, India's Nifty index continues to struggle near the lows of the last 12 weeks. Japan's Nikkei looked positive with gaps up early in the week, but on Friday it gapped down over 1,000 points and created a chart pattern known as a bearish island reversal. China and Hong Kong's markets basically went sideways in the middle of the range, covering the recent huge rally. Australia's ASX index fell to a 7-week low. Just 2 weeks ago, it was at an all-time high. In Europe, the mood was bleaker. On October 31st, the Netherlands AEX, London FTSE, and Zurich SMI all fell to 12-week lows. The German DAX index was stronger, only falling to a 3-week low. The U.S. stock indices were an enigma. The Nasdaq had been the only major index not to have made a new all-time high in October, but last week it was the only market index to make a new record high. The Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P fell to multi-week lows after their recent all-time highs on October 17th and 18th. Thus, a case of intermarket bearish divergence ended, but then a new one began. Now, the short-term geocosmics and longer-term thoughts, including Ray's comments about Sunday's Mars-Pluto opposition. First, some quotes. First, from the Wall Street Journal opinion column, Dan Henniger's "Trump's a fascist, Harris is stupid. An election from the bottom of the barrel is almost over." He says, regardless of the winner, this election has produced an emerging political reality. The country is moving to the right, or at least center-right, and is likely to stay there. I don't believe this drift is directly attributable to Mr. Trump himself. He wrote it, but he didn't cause a tectonic shift in America's politics. The highly politicized idea of wokeness is in broad decline, a victim of its own unreflective overreaching and intolerance of questions of equity, gender, and climate. The United States has had enough of its endless demands. The next is from Jeff Bezos, the op-ed in the Washington Post, which he owns, explaining why the Post did not endorse Kamala Harris or any candidate this year. It was published October 28th. He says, presidential endorsements do nothing to tip the scales of an election. What presidential endorsements actually do is create a perception of bias. Ending them is a principled decision, and it's the right one. Eugene Meyer, publisher of the Washington Post from 1933 to 1946, thought the same, and he was right. By itself, declining to endorse presidential candidates is not enough to move us very far up the trust scale, but it is a meaningful step in the right direction. And then from Thursday's Wall Street Journal, Peggy Noonan, A Great Democracy, faces a bad choice. She says anyone who claims to know what's going to happen is lying, but people wish they had a better choice. They don't want him in there, and they can't see her there. That's why it's close. He's too crazy for me. They're too extreme. He's mad, bad, and dangerous to know. She and her party continue to move too damagingly to the left. Here is an institution we helped this year, unknowingly, without really meaning to. In this messy monster of a campaign, we enlivened and perhaps even revitalized democracy. It's the big story underneath the big story. Now some lyrics. Irving Taylor, Ain't Nobody's Business But My Own, Kiss Music Company, 1950. It's nobody's business but my own. Well, it ain't nobody's, no, it ain't. It ain't nobody's business. It's nobody's business but my own. Ray says, it appears elections have consequences. Rather, the perception of election results also has consequences, as noted by market behavior this past week. Prior to last week, Trump was steamrolling ahead. But by the middle of the week, the election was back to a dead heat. Trump's early October bump related to transiting Jupiter stationary on October 9th, very close to his natal sun in Gemini, is starting to fade as the great benefic Jupiter begins pulling back under its retrograde motion. Will there be enough juice left to carry him to victory? The same could be asked of Kamala Harris, whose Gemini ascendant is also close to transiting Jupiter. It is pulling back now as well. Furthermore, as outlined in this column, she had her peak of support in August and September when her progressed moon conjoined the U.S. natal sun. But now that conjunction started separating as of mid-September when polls had her leading. Can she last it out another week? Sure, they both can. And that's why any astrologer or pundit who claims they know who will win just doesn't know that they don't know. There are astrological studies, correlations to past election cycles, that support both candidates, as discussed last week. But no matter. Once the election is over, half the pundits who guessed right will claim paranormal, clairvoyant powers. That's life when you see astrology as entertainment or fortune-telling. It is much more than that. It has value to societies beyond that. In reality, predictions are just information, not truth. However, if the source of that information has a reliable track record for accuracy and also derives their outlook based on actual correlative studies, let's say 80%, then it has value in the sense that one can make a plan based on higher than normal probabilities. As far as the astrological conditions of the next week, they look tense. The warlike, take no prisoners, show no mercy aspect of Mars changing signs from Cancer to Leo, and in opposition to Pluto, is nothing to mess around with. This is a dynamic that could coincide with confrontations, even violence, and one would be wise to avoid potentially dangerous and explosive situations. On top of that, the moon will ingress into Sagittarius starting November 3rd, the sign of exaggeration and no holes barred. While at the same time, Venus will be in opposition to Jupiter, ruler of the Sagittarius moon. Things could get out of control, even violent, this weekend through early next week. This combination is already manifesting in the burning of ballot boxes in some states, which is a typical expression, arson, destruction of property, under a Mars-Pluto hard aspect. Markets won't like it if no decisive winner is announced rather quickly. In that case, stock markets could fall, perhaps into the next level 1 signature, which is Saturn turning direct on November 15th, which is also a full moon. That is still within 2 weeks of the election, when lows in U.S. stock indices tend to happen, if they didn't just happen last Thursday, October 31st, on Halloween. This is Scorpio season. In fact, on Friday, November 1st, there was a new moon in Scorpio. Mars and Pluto co-rule Scorpio. The dynamics of a new moon can also last up to 2 weeks. You don't want to take risks to your safety under a Mars-Pluto hard aspect or under a Scorpio new or full moon. Play it safe. Scorpio is excellent for intimacy and deep conversations. Make love. Avoid war. And keep your vote and all secrets and private matters to yourself. It's nobody's business but your own. Scorpio's rule. Respect it. And that's the end of this week's newsletter. There is information online at MMAcycles.com about ordering for the 2025 forecast book, which we featured an excerpt from on the Fun Astrology podcast on Wednesday, this past October 30th. So if you'd like to check that out, it's on that podcast, and there's order information for the audiobook as well. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great weekend. Pray for peace. I'll see you for Level Up Sunday night, then back on the Fun Astrology podcast on Monday. Thanks for listening.